Hello guys, welcome back to today's lesson. Today we'll be continuing from where we stopped when we were talking about CSS Basics. Alright, so let's quickly go over the agenda for today. Alright, so we're going to be talking about width and height. We'll talk about different types of CSS combinators, but for this lesson we'll be talking about just the primary combinators. Right, we'll talk about inline and block level elements. I think we've spoken about this before in one of the previous lessons. And then we'll talk about inline block, which is different from inline because there's inline, there's block, and then there's inline block. Right, so we'll be seeing how this inline block differs from regular inline and block level elements. And then lastly, I'll be explaining how margin and padding work. All right, so without further ado, let's get into it. Yes, so um the width and height are properties that basically control the dimensions of elements. So it's pretty simple. They are controlled in units. And for this example, we have pixels, but there are other units like percentages. There's viewport width, there's viewport height. All right. Aside width and height, there are other two properties that control dimensions of elements that are also very important: the mean width, mean height, max width, and max height. So the mean width basically says that that element is not going to get smaller in width size than the particular number that has been set. Right, same thing for width, mean height, and same thing goes for the max. When you set an element to maximum width of 500, it doesn't grow wider than that 500. Same thing for the height. Now it's very important to know that your um minimum height, minimum width, whatever it is, they have priority over your regular width and height sizes. Right, so let's say you set an element and you give it a width of 600 and you give it a maximum width of 500. That element is going to have the width of 500 pixels. Right, so CSS prioritizes um the mean width, mean height, max width, max height over regular width and height properties. Great. So let's move to the next thing. The next thing we have is different types of CSS combinators. All right, so we're talking about the primary ones, right? So we have the descendant combinator, we have the child combinator, we have the next sibling combinator, and we have the subsequent sibling combinator. Right, so I'm going to be explaining each of them. Right, so the descendant combinator, right, this is the first example we have here at the top: the parent space and child. So let's say you have a div, right? Let's say you have a div element and you've nested a p tag inside, or 5 p tags inside that div element. Now according to this styling, they are all going to have a border of 4 pixels solid black. Right, that's why it's called descendant combinator. Right, so every child of that container, every child of that parent is going to, let's say you have like 5 p tags or 7 p tags, right? And you see div space p, every p tag inside that div is going to have a border of 4 pixels solid black. Descendant combinator. Right, let's move over to the child coordinate combinator, which is this next one here, that has the right angle, right, sign. All right, so basically what this does is it's going to style the first or the immediate children, right? So descendant, even if let's say you have a div container and you have another div container nested inside that div container, right? Now this second div container inside the first one has a p tag, right? And maybe you have p tags that are immediate child elements of the parent. So every p tag, no matter how deep they are nested, no matter if they are inside more div element, its descendant, as long as it's a descendant, every p tag that is inside, no matter if they have, if even no matter if they are grandchildren or great grandchildren, they're all going to have a border of 4 pixels solid black, right? But the child combinator would style the immediate children, not the grandchildren and not the great grandchildren. Is going to style the children, the immediate children, right? That's the difference between the descendant combinator and the child combinator. Now let's move on to the next sibling combinator. So these are siblings combinator, not necessarily parent and child relationship. They're relationship between siblings, right? So let's say you have a div element and you have this image tag and this fig caption tag. All right. So basically, what that what that next sibling does is it's going to style that fig, the fig caption that comes out, that comes after the image tag, right? That comes after the image tag. So let's say you have a parent container div, a div parent container, or let's say a figure. Let's use a figure element, right? And it's a parent, and you have, and inside that figure element, you have your image, your img tag, and your fig caption tag, right? To style the fig caption, you can target that image using the, you can target the image and then use the next sibling combinator to target the fig caption, right? That's how this works. Now the next one we have, or the last one, would be the subsequent sibling combinator, right? And so let's say you have like a container, right? You have a div element that has a class of container, and you have, let's say, a h1, a header element, and you have 4p elements below it or after it. Now using the subsequent sibling combinator, if you target that h2 using that subsequent combinator with the p, so let's say instead of img and fig caption, let's say we have h2 and then p. All the p tags that are after that h2 are going to have the border of 4 pixels solid black. This might not really make a lot of sense until we go to the code editor to try them out and see how they work. So when we get to our practical section, we'll try them out and see the differences and see, so that we can better internalize them. All right, so let's move on to the next thing. The next thing we have is difference between inline and block level elements. Right, so block level elements are elements that take up the entire width of the screen. Right, they take up their entire width for that particular line, and they push any element after them to a new line. Right, they push any element after them to a new line. Whereas inline elements, they only need the space. They take up as much width size as they need, right? And they do not start on a new line. Now if you notice the feedback form we did, you'd see that the input elements were stacked together on the same line. That's because they are inline elements, right? So elements like paragraph h1, if you notice, they have their own margins. They push the next elements after them to a new line, and they take up that entire width for that particular line they are on, right? So if you put an element next to them, it doesn't show up on the browser, it will be pushed to the next line. Now that's the difference between block level elements and inline elements. So basically, to set an element to block, you use the display property and give it a value of block. For inline, use the display property and give it a value of inline. All right, let's move to the next thing. How does inline block differ from inline and block elements. So the difference is it's very easy, right? So inline blocks is like a hybrid between um, block level elements and inline elements, and I'll explain why. Right. So for inline elements, you can't really manipulate the width and height, right? You can't really manipulate the width and height. You can't set it. Whereas for block elements, block level elements, you can do this, right? So the difference is that inline elements, they don't push other elements around them to a new line, right? But you can adjust their width and height. So they don't push other elements around them to a new line, but you can adjust their width and height. So that's the difference between an inline element and an inline block element. Inline block elements, this they don't push other elements around them to a new line, same as inline, but inline block elements, you can adjust their width and height. All right, so moving on to the last thing we have here, which is margins and paddings, right? So it's very important to understand margins and paddings because sometimes it could be tricky. So let's assume we have a div element, right? And the div element is what has this border. The div element has this border, right? Now inside that div element, you might have another element, a child element, or you can have a content, right? So think of this border as the box of your div element, because basically everything on every particular element is a box. So this is called the box model actually. So every particular element is, you can see it as a box, right? There's left, there's right, there's top, there's bottom. The page is the same thing, top, left, bottom, and right. So you can think of every element as a box, right? So thinking of the div element as a box, there is something that is inside that box, and there are things that are outside the box. To control the space inside the box, you use padding. To control the space that's outside the box, you use margin. All right, so let's say this div element has this color, right? So to give it space between its content and its borders, or the content and its edges, you're probably going to use padding. That's what's going to work. But let's say you have an element before it. Let's say you have a section element before it, and they are too close together, but you want more space at the top of that your div element. You're going to use your margin to manipulate and give space between the two elements, right? It sounds a little bit tricky at the beginning, but with time, when you use it, you get to understand. The major thing is just to understand that you use margin to control the spaces outside of that element, spaces around that element, and you use padding to control the spaces that are inside within that element. All right, so that's all for today. Thank you for joining, thank you for listening. I hope you've been able to learn one or two things. See you in the next lesson.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.